Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, July 2nd, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Trump says U.S. and Israeli officials discussed Gaza. So President Trump said in a post on Truth Social on Tuesday that his representatives met with Israeli officials and discussed the idea of a potential 60-day Gaza ceasefire deal, a proposal that Hamas is unlikely to accept without an upfront commitment to a permanent truce. The post came after Axios reported that U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Vice President J.D. Vance were expected to meet with Ron Dermer, Israel's Minister of Strategic Affairs and close ally of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So this is what Trump wrote on Truth Social. He said, quote, "My representatives had a long and productive meeting with the Israelis today on Gaza. Israel has agreed to the necessary conditions to finalize the 60-day ceasefire, during which time we will work with all parties to end the war. The Qataris and Egyptians, who have worked very hard to help bring peace, will deliver this final proposal. I hope for the good of the Middle East that Hamas takes this deal because it will not get better. It will only get worse. Thank you for your attention to this matter," end quote. So this kind of sounds like the same old deal that they've been putting forward without a commitment to a permanent ceasefire up front, that is Hamas's main demand, because one reason why is because they did sign a ceasefire deal in January and the first phase was implemented. But during that first phase, the U.S. and Israel were supposed to enter negotiations to reach a permanent deal, and Israel never entered those negotiations, and they unilaterally violated the ceasefire by imposing a total blockade on Gaza, and then restarting the bombing campaign. And according to the Axios report, Witkoff was set to brief Dermer on efforts to reach a 60-day truce, during which Hamas would release 10 Israeli captives. Again, this is the same old deal that's apparently been on the table, but it hasn't gone anywhere. And a Hamas official said earlier this week that Netanyahu doesn't want a deal because he's putting forward impossible conditions. And again, only talking about the release of 10 hostages, when Hamas's long-standing offer is that they would release all of them at once in exchange for a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal. And the Axios report said that the main impasse between the two sides is Hamas's demand for a clear guarantee from the U.S. that the deal would lead to a permanent end to the genocidal war. A senior Israeli official told Axios that Israel is willing to adjust some of the deal's language to make it more acceptable to Hamas, but won't agree to an upfront commitment to a permanent truce. The idea of the previous ceasefire deal that was signed in January, as I mentioned, was to enter negotiations, but those negotiations never happened. And Israel has been escalating its assault on Gaza and is prepared to ramp things up even more. An Israeli official told Axios that they're ready to turn Gaza into dust if the negotiations don't advance. The official said, quote, "We'll do to Gaza City and the central camps what we did to Rafah. Everything will turn to dust," end quote. So the way that Trump is framing it is concerning, because it's sounding like he's saying, okay, Israel's accepted this deal. Now it's up to Hamas. If they don't accept it, then things are going to get much worse. And that's not good, because this is something Netanyahu has done throughout all the negotiations, both before the January ceasefire deal was reached in 2024, was, he knew ways to make sure Hamas wouldn't accept the deal. And, he could do some of those tricks to make sure there's no agreement, and then get Trump to say, oh, well, we tried, now, do whatever you want. And Israel already is doing whatever it wants in Gaza, and we are seeing what that looks like. So hopefully my pessimism is wrong, and that this does lead to some kind of deal. I do believe if there's even a temporary ceasefire, that will raise the chances of it turning into a permanent deal. Even though we have reasons not to trust the U.S. and Israel when it comes to negotiations and ceasefire deals. But again, hopefully this does lead somewhere. All right, so the next one here, Israeli forces kill 112 Palestinians in Gaza over 24 hours. So the daily reality in Gaza. Gaza's health ministry said on Tuesday that Israeli forces killed 112 Palestinians and wounded 463 over the previous 24-hour period as relentless U.S.-backed Israeli strikes continued to pound targets across the Strip. I mean, just huge death tolls. And this is something I've seen from Palestinians in Gaza that speak to media outlets. They say, we see all these reports, all this news about a ceasefire, but here we're getting killed, more than ever. And hospital sources told Al Jazeera that at least 16 Palestinians were killed on Tuesday while attempting to get aid. The health ministry said that since the U.S. and Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation began operating at the end of May, more than 600 aid seekers have been killed. So these daily aid massacres continue, even though it's been exposed, even though the Israeli military has admitted to killing unarmed civilians near these aid sites. It goes on. Again, Israel is just operating with total impunity, and none of this would be possible without all this support from the U.S. The Israeli military admitted on Monday that its forces had killed some civilians near GHF aid sites, as I mentioned here. So Israeli strikes hit targets just across Gaza. 10 were killed in Khan Yunis in the bombing of a house. In Zaytun, Gaza City, at least 8 Palestinians were killed. 5 were killed in central Gaza in a strike on a home. So, I mean, this is just a fraction of the massacres that happened in Gaza. There's also a report, and I saw pictures of a 29-year-old man who died of starvation in Gaza, and he just looked completely emaciated. He must have had some kind of health problems where he needed real food, real protein, real nutrients, which people in Gaza cannot get. A few days earlier, 2 infants died of starvation because there's a baby formula shortage, because that's one of the things Israel is restricting and blocking from entering Gaza. Baby formula. All right, so the next one here. One thing I want to mention, I'm working in my new office and I have a window AC unit. The AC is not on, but it means everything outside is louder. And I think the microphone might be picking up the thunderstorm that's happening outside. So if you hear anything, that's that. I got to kind of figure out how to make the sound better with my setup here. I know the other night some people said that they heard the frogs. The tree frogs were especially loud, and the microphone picked them up. But anyway, so the next story here, over 170 NGOs urge end to U.S.-Israeli aid traps in Gaza. So this article is from The Cradle. So more than 170 international NGOs, including Oxfam, Save the Children, Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, and the Norwegian Refugee Council. So these are the leading, international charities. They issued a joint declaration on July 1st in Geneva calling for an immediate end to the U.S. Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. According to medical authorities, over 550 Palestinians have been killed. Now over 600 have been killed since the foundation began operating. The statement said that, quote, Palestinians in Gaza face an impossible choice: starve or risk being shot while trying desperately to reach food to feed their families, end quote. And one thing that they say is this goes against humanitarian protocol because you're making displaced people, emaciated, wounded, sick people travel very far to get food and travel through a war zone, an area where they can get killed. What they're saying is go back to the UN mechanisms, which brings the food to the charity bakeries and places in the neighborhoods and in the tent camps where people are actually living, so they don't have to go this far and risk getting shot and killed by Israeli forces to get food. And this has kind of been the stance of all the big aid groups. They've been against this since the beginning. Because this is just it's clearly part of Israel's military strategy, is the way that they set up these, where they set up these aid sites. And I believe it's part of their strategy to just make life as miserable as possible. And obviously now, so they can, pick people off when they're on the way to these aid sites. I mean, I don't think there's any denying that is part of the strategy now, especially since there's that Haaretz report that said they're actually ordered to fire on unarmed Palestinians. All right, so the next one here, Israel limits entry of baby formula in Gaza as infants die of hunger. So this article is from Le Monde, and the reason why I wanted to run it, I mean, we've covered the formula shortage, which again is just such an evil thing to put restrictions on. I mean, how can you justify that? But the reason why I wanted to include this, because there's an American doctor who was traveling into Gaza at the end of June, and he was trying to bring suitcases full of baby formula because he knew there was baby formula shortages. People that were traveling with him said, they're probably not going to let you in with all that stuff. You should not try to bring it. And he said, okay. And he just brought a few cans of baby formula with him, and the IDF confiscated the baby formula. It was like, what does he say here? 3 cans of baby formula. An American doctor. I mean, what is the justification there? I just don't know how people can justify this, explain this as not. I mean, they're not just trying to starve people. They're starving babies. I mean, it's just absolutely evil. All right, so the next one here, Pentagon halts some shipments to Ukraine. So the Pentagon has halted shipments of some air defense missiles and other munitions to Ukraine over concerns that U.S. stockpiles have gotten too low. And this was reported by Politico. The report said that the decision was driven by Elbridge Colby. He's the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, who is a China hawk who wants the U.S. to focus on building up its forces in the Asia Pacific to prepare for a conflict over Taiwan. And this is kind of what his whole career has been focused on, at least in recent years, is that the U.S. should be focused on preparing for a war with China to prevent them from taking over Taiwan, despite their risk of nuclear war. So I guess that's the thinking here, is that they're worried that they've depleted too many, of the U.S. military stockpiles. And the halt of shipments was ordered after a review of Pentagon stockpiles. And the U.S. has sent Ukraine an enormous number of weapons, of these air defenses and things like that. And the U.S. has also depleted a lot of its air defenses and other types of weapons by supporting Israel's wars in the Middle East and during the 12-day war against Iran. And Israel's also been using a lot of this U.S.-made equipment as well, so that's a big factor here, is the shortage is there. And that is one reason why Israel agreed to a ceasefire, was because they were running low on their U.S.-made interceptors and things like that. So the shipments that have been paused were previously pledged to Ukraine under the Biden administration, using 2 types of aid mechanisms: the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows the U.S. to ship weapons directly from Pentagon stockpiles, and the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which authorizes the U.S. to purchase weapons for Ukraine. And during his final months in office, President Biden approved billions of dollars worth of weapon shipments under the 2 mechanisms, which will take years to deliver. The Trump administration briefly paused the shipments following the Oval Office blowup between President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, but the assistance was quickly resumed after U.S. and Ukrainian officials held another meeting. So will this impact negotiations? Ukraine making more, will this make Ukraine more likely to make concessions to Russia? Maybe. I think it depends on the extent of the pause on these shipments, exactly how many they are withholding. And we'll see if this, if we learn, get more information about this in the coming days. All right, so the next one here, Ukrainian drone attack kills 3 at a factory deep inside Russia. So on Tuesday, a Ukrainian drone attack hit a factory in the Russian city of Izhevsk, which is about 740 miles from Ukraine's border, killing at least 3 workers and wounding 35. This is according to the governor of the region, who said that he didn't name the factory that was targeted, but a Ukrainian source told Reuters that the security service of Ukraine, the SBU, launched the attack and struck the Kupol plant, and they said that the factory is involved in the production of drones and air defenses. And I saw that's what kind of Russian Telegram channels and things also said, that it did strike this factory. And again, this is very deep inside Russia. And this comes after Russia has been launching massive drone and missile attacks across Ukraine. And it's only a few weeks after the SBU pulled off that big drone attack inside Russia that targeted strategic bombers at Russian airfields. And in response to that, Russia really ramped up its bombing of Ukraine, drone and missile attacks. And that has typically been Russia's reaction to these attacks deep inside their territory, is to ramp things up in Ukraine. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see some more massive Russian attacks across Ukraine after this. And fighting also continues to rage across the front lines in Ukraine. And Russia now controls all of the Luhansk Oblast and has started capturing villages in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. I know I butchered that pronunciation. But they captured a village there, and this is a new region that they pushed into just last month. So Ukraine is continuing to lose territory. And efforts to reach a peace deal have stalled. And the fact is Russia's made clear that they're not going to give up on their territorial demands for Ukraine to withdraw from the remaining territory that it controls in Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, these oblasts that they annexed in 2022. And they also want Ukrainian neutrality, Russia's made it clear they're happy to keep the war going until Ukraine makes those concessions. And the fact is, as the war goes on, I think as time goes on, the potential peace deal is just going to get worse and worse for Ukraine. And we have a poll on the lower part of the page that's found 56% of Ukrainians want peace, or want a compromise for a peace deal. Again, I just think the fact is, as long as this thing goes on, Ukraine is going to lose more. So the right thing to do for the U.S. would be to cut off the military aid to Zelensky and make him make a deal, because I believe it's just going to get worse and worse. All right. I know some people who watch my show, listen to my show, who agree with me on Gaza and everything, do not agree with my position on Ukraine. But again, realistically, things are just going to get worse and more drawn out. All right, so the next one here, Iran has not decided on resuming talks with U.S. So Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has said that Tehran needs time to decide whether or not it will resume talks with the U.S. following the 12-day U.S.-Israeli war against Iran, which was launched under the cover of negotiations. President Trump has previously said that talks could resume as early as this week, and this claim has been denied by Tehran. So this is Araghchi speaking to CBS News. He said, quote, "I don't think negotiations will restart as quickly as that. In order for us to decide to re-engage, we will have to first ensure that America will not revert back to targeting us in a military attack during the negotiations. And I think with all these considerations, we still need more time," end quote. Israel launched the war on June 13th, 2 days before the U.S. and Iran were scheduled to hold another round of talks. So when he says we need to make sure that they're not going to attack us again, I mean, that's a very reasonable... I mean, they would kind of be crazy to trust the U.S. right now to just enter negotiations again, I think. That's why, I mean, for all... Besides the risk and everything that, all the reasons why it was wrong for the U.S. to back and launch this war against Iran, one of the main ones is totally killing its credibility in the diplomatic stage. And this deception campaign that they engaged in. So obviously Iran is not just going to run right back into negotiations. Araghchi did not rule out resuming negotiations with the U.S. in the future, saying that the doors of diplomacy will never slam shut. He also said Iran could swiftly resume its nuclear enrichment program if there is a will to do so in Iran, despite the U.S. bombing 3 of its nuclear facilities. He said, quote, "One cannot obliterate the technology and science for enrichment through bombings. If there is a will on our part, and the will exists in order to once again make progress in this industry, we will be able to expeditiously repair the damages and make up for the lost time." He said Iran's peaceful nuclear program has turned into a matter of national pride and glory. "We have also gone through 12 days of imposed war. Therefore, people will not easily back down from enrichment," end quote. And Trump is saying that he's going to bomb Iran again if they restart the enrichment, but he's also saying he doesn't think that's going to happen. He doesn't think he even needs a nuclear deal with them because everything's been obliterated. So we'll see how everything plays out. And just a reminder at the end of the story here, neither the U.S. nor the IAEA had any evidence that Iran was making or working toward a nuclear bomb when this war was launched. All right, so the next one here, Huckabee suggests U.S. B-2 bombers should visit Yemen. So U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee suggested on Tuesday that U.S. B-2 bombers should visit Yemen after Yemen's Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, fired a missile at Israel, as the Yemeni group has vowed to keep up attacks on Israel until the genocide in Gaza comes to an end. So Huckabee wrote on X, quote, "We thought we were done with missiles coming to Israel, but Houthis just lit one up over us in Israel. Fortunately, Israel's incredible interception system means we go to the shelter and wait until all clear. Maybe those B-2 bombers need to visit Yemen," end quote. So U.S. B-2 bombers actually did recently visit Yemen as part of that very heavy bombing campaign that President Trump launched from March 15th to May 6th. Which involved over 1,000 missile strikes and killed 258 civilians. A very bloody campaign, huge civilian toll. One massacre of civilians at the Ras Issa fuel port that killed 84 civilians, and also the bombing of a migrant detention center that killed about 60 African migrants. And B-2 bombers were reportedly used in some of the strikes on Yemen in that month and a half, according to Fox News. And despite these U.S. attacks, the Houthis were able to fire on U.S. warships and launch missiles at Israel. And Trump eventually agreed to a ceasefire with the Houthis, which he framed as a victory, but the U.S. essentially gave up on trying to get the Houthis to stop their attacks on Israel. So there's another threat from Israel Katz, the defense minister, saying that, after this missile attack, that Israel will treat Yemen like Tehran, referring to its recent bombing campaign in Tehran. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see Israeli warplanes carry out another round of airstrikes against Yemen. All right, so the next one here, the IDF sets up new base in Syria's Quneitra. So this one is from Jason Ditz. So when Israel invaded southwest Syria in December, the Quneitra government was the first place hit. Right along the frontier of the occupied Golan Heights, Israeli forces entered after the ouster of the Assad government. They have only expanded the amount of area they've advanced into, covering more of Quneitra and also the Dara government. And despite their expansion, Israeli forces have not established clear lines of control. They raid villages, harass locals, and move on. There's a concern, however, that in some areas the occupation is getting more official and permanent, with troops building new military posts. And they're setting up a new base on Al Amar Hill in Quneitra. Israel has already set up a base on the western part of the hill. Again, this is just showing that they're solidifying this occupation of southern Syria, and this is territory that they have captured since after the regime change that ousted Assad in December. All right, so the next one here, Israel has killed 1,000 Palestinians in the West Bank since October 7th. So this article is from Al Jazeera. So since October 7th, 2023, Israel has escalated its violence in the occupied West Bank, killing 1,000 Palestinians. As the world was distracted by Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, which has killed more than 56,331 people, and I think the death toll is much higher than that, and uprooted nearly the entire population of 2.3 million, Israel ramped up its violent raids on the West Bank, as well as its silence as Israeli settlers attack and kill Palestinian villages. The most recent casualty was Samir Bassem al-Zagarna, a young man who was shot by Israeli soldiers on July 1st. So now the death toll has reached 1,000. And again, this is people killed by Israeli forces and settlers, and 9,230 people have been injured, and among the dead are 202 children. When it comes to the West Bank, these are big numbers. It kind of pales in comparison to Gaza, but when it comes to the violence in the West Bank, 1,000 people killed in a year and a half is a lot. I guess it's been about 20 months now, but it's a very high number for the West Bank. All right, so the next story here, the 44th U.S. airstrike in Somalia this year. So U.S. Africa Command announced on Tuesday that its forces launched another airstrike in Somalia as the Trump administration continues to bomb the country at a record pace. AFRICOM said the strike targeted the ISIS affiliate in northeastern Somalia's Puntland region, where the U.S. is backing local forces. The command offered no details on the strike other than saying that it was launched to the southeast of Bosaso, a port city in Puntland. AFRICOM, as usual, shared no details, no estimates of casualties or civilian harm. They stopped sharing those details in April. And I actually asked AFRICOM at the time, what's the deal? Why aren't you sharing the casualty numbers anymore? And they said they're not doing it as the Trump administration settles in. Well, they've certainly been settled in at this point, and we're still not seeing that information. And based on AFRICOM's count, the bombing brings the total number of U.S. airstrikes in Somalia this year to 44. And this is just a huge number. As someone who's tracked this U.S. air war for a few years now, this is huge. And it's just nobody's even aware of it. It's not getting any media coverage. And the Trump administration is well on its way to breaking the record for the total number of U.S. airstrikes in Somalia in a single year, which President Trump set at 63 in 2019. U.S. airstrikes in Puntland could escalate in the coming days and weeks as local Puntland forces announced a new operation against ISIS on Monday. The U.S. has also been supporting the Mogadishu-based federal government in its fight against al-Shabaab in southern and central Somalia. And Somali media reported on Monday that there were fierce clashes in Jubaland, southern Somalia, between al-Shabaab and the Danab, which is a special U.S.-trained and armed military unit of the government military. And it said at least 7 al-Shabaab fighters were killed. And it's unclear right now if the U.S., they usually support them in big battles with airstrikes. It's unclear if the U.S. launched any in this battle on Monday. AFRICOM usually announces its airstrikes a few days after they're launched. But again, this just goes on and barely anyone notices. And I don't put too much effort into looking for other media coverage of this, but a lot of times I just Google, U.S. airstrike in Somalia, look at the news tab, and there's nothing, besides us and the AFRICOM press release. So it just really goes unnoticed. All right, so the next one here, Trump to ramp up pressure on Cuba. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So President Donald Trump ordered his administration to ramp up efforts to bring down the government in Cuba. The policy calls for tightening sanctions and programs. So sanctions that have been in place for over 60 years, they're going to ramp them up. It's just, this is one of the dumbest policies of the U.S. government, is just maintaining this embargo on Cuba, this country that is 90 miles off of our coast. It's a totally failed policy. Essentially, this is done because they want votes from the Cuban Americans in Miami who, for some reason, support this economic warfare against their the country that their family came from. And so President Trump issued the memo to his administration on Monday that instructed the strengthening of the hostile policy against Cuba. The approach calls for tighter enforcement of existing sanctions and travel restrictions against the Caribbean nation. In addition, Washington will step up its considerable efforts to undermine the government by funding programs that ostensibly promote democracy. However, similar programs have been used by the U.S. around the globe to carry out regime change operations and things like that. And Biden didn't really, I think Biden might have very slightly eased a few Cuba-related things, but it was easy for Trump to reimpose them. And the U.S. has maintained this embargo against Cuba, of course, since the 1960s. And Obama took some steps toward normalizing relations with Cuba, but he didn't fully lift the embargo. And Trump reversed all those steps. And again, Biden, I don't think Biden did anything significant. Everything was easy for Trump to reverse, and it just goes on. And it's just an example of how sanctions, again, it's been so many decades and it's the same governments in power, and the sanctions have only hurt the people living under that government. All right, so the next one, the last story here, the big beautiful bill adds $150 billion in military spending. So the Senate on Tuesday advanced a massive spending package dubbed the Big Beautiful Bill by President Trump that includes $150 billion in extra military spending. The bill passed in a vote of 51-50 with Vice President J.D. Vance casting the tie-breaking vote as 3 Republicans, Senators Rand Paul, Susan Collins, and Tom Tillis, joined Democrats in voting against the sprawling piece of legislation. House GOP leaders have scheduled a vote for the bill on Wednesday and are hoping to get it to President Trump's desk by this Friday, though uncertainty remains about how fast it will get through the chamber. The $150 billion bill will fund several of the Trump administration's priorities. This, again, the $150 billion in extra military spending, including the Golden Dome, the big missile defense system that Trump wants over the United States. That is just going to be a total boondoggle for the arms makers. And I wonder if SpaceX is still going to get the contract now that Elon and Trump are beefing. Elon came out very strongly against this bill. But anyway, the whole Golden Dome thing, it's going to kick off a new arms race. It's a very bad idea. But the majority of the $150 billion, again, it's going to be spent on kind of all different things, but most of it is meant to supplement the 2026 military budget to bring it over the $1 trillion mark that Trump wants. So the White House has requested a $892 billion military budget for 2026. That's mostly the Pentagon. It includes some other spending like the Energy Department's nuclear weapons program, but the bulk of it is the Pentagon. So that's the request for the official National Defense Authorization Act. But then they're going to take $113 billion from this $150 billion and add it to that, and that will bring the total national security budget for 2026 to $1.006 trillion. Now, I know many of you are thinking that we probably spend way more than that as it is, which is true. But this will be, there's never been an official military budget over $1 trillion. But when you factor in other spending like Homeland Security, like Veterans Affairs, the interest on the national debt that is related to national security spending, we get very close to $2 trillion, factoring in those other things. But this is a big part of this big, beautiful bill, which is going to, I think, increase the debt by $4 trillion over the next however many years. I haven't been paying attention to all the specifics, but I think for our purposes, the $150 billion in additional military spending is important to cover. So that is it for the news for today. We've been going over so many different topics lately. I hope I'm not trying to cram too much information into this kind of short show that I do. But today I wrote 8 articles. I haven't written 8 in a long time. I usually average around 6. All right, our viewpoints, one from Sheldon Richmond, the U.S. Empire's 72-year war on Iran. One from William D. Hartung, the military-industrial complex is riding high. One from Maron Rappaport, Israel's euphoric victory over Iran is quickly giving way to disillusionment. One from Brandon P. Buck, the lost liberalism of America first. And our spotlight from Taqwa Ahmed Al-Wawi, in Gaza, the Israelis are staging Hunger Games. So please go check all of that out. Go visit antiwar.com, even if you listen to or watch this show. You could always support us by liking, sharing, subscribing, all that stuff. Go to antiwar.com/donate if you want to give us a monetary donation. I'm also looking for sponsors for this show. I think I want to start doing some ads now that I have a decent amount of people listening. I think my idea is basically, do the little intro that I always do and then say, oh, this episode is sponsored by this business or product or whatever. And then we'll get into the show. Try to keep it quick. So, I don't plan on packing the full show full of different ads. But anyway, that is it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.